Let's talk first to Henry Hill. He's Deputy Editor of Conservative Home. Henry, great to have you in the programme this afternoon. How are you?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Let's start with Rachel Reeves. Right, you can wave a magic wand, Henry. You can say 5% cuts to any government department. Which one would you choose?
But I mean, this is the problem is I'm an enthusiast to this, right? So for me the difficulty is like, can we not apply to more than one department?
Well, all right, I'll give you 10% for 3 departments. Go.
I mean, I would probably go with culture, media, and sport, DCIT, and then probably, frankly, the Department of Health, but in exchange for making up the money from the private sector, which I think is perfectly possible. I mean, you could make the case for almost any department. The ones that I think you really need to defend are education and defence, places like that. But many of our departments, you have things that you could make cuts to.
Yeah, I mean, and also it's about doing things more efficiently as well. I mean, my view of the Home Office, having worked there previously, is that you could do a lot more with a lot fewer people. It's interesting as well when you think about things like the Ministry of Justice. You definitely need money to build prisons, no doubt about that. Do you need all those, and you certainly need probation officers to deal with people getting out of prison, but do you need all those civil servants, do you need all those people who never set foot in a prison running the prison service? That's a big question as well. But certainly Rachel Reeves, talk us through this, Henry, because she's written, and she and her deputy Darren Jones, who's the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, they've written to all these cabinet ministers today. They're not going to be too enthusiastic about saying, oh yes, you've just had a budget where many departmental budgets have been cut. You know, what else are you going to cut now?
Well, exactly. I think this is the challenge for Labour, is that they were elected on a manifesto that didn't really have all that much in it. But the sort of general vibe was, you know, everything's fine. We've got a plan, and then they didn't really. I mean, even to an extent, and this isn't a partisan point. I gave them a lot of rope before the election in terms of the scope of what they had to do, but they really don't seem to have had any kind of big idea about what they were going to do with the state. And so now those ministers were worried because, you know, it's not even 6 months since they were first elected, and if you're a Labour MP, you're not really elected to cut things, right? You know, that's what the other side do. But also they'll be looking at Rachel Reeves' promises, because she said that, you know, after this budget, this is her 5-year spending envelope. It's her plan for the entire Parliament. And they'll have seen that in years 3, 4, and 5, after this initial spending spree, which, you know, would you believe it, Labour is currently on, despite the fact that they're asking for cuts, there really is no money at all earmarked for anything in terms of additional growth. And they'll be worried that if we're cutting even during this period, when you're actually allocating your money for things, what on earth is 2026, 2027 going to be like?
And actually, if you look at, as I'm sure you have, the estimations of their own calculations within the Treasury and the Independent Office of Budgetary Responsibility, they're saying there's just no way you're going to get to the 2.5% growth of the economy that Labour says we need. And that's just, you know, that is just not going to happen. Keir Starmer has changed his views, changed his language on that in the last few days, saying that we should be not in any way not saying that we should be the biggest growth in the G7, but the biggest growth in Europe, which is a lot easier, especially when you look at various countries like France and Germany. So I just wonder, where is this growth going to come from? I mean, what is Labour saying that they're going to defy the experts on this?
I've got no idea. I mean, the first thing to note is that pure GDP growth is not what they were originally talking about before the election. Rachel Reeves used to talk about living standards, and that meant, if you're jargonizing it, GDP per capita growth, right? Which, you know, is GDP divided by the number of people in the country, i.e., are we richer or not? But any government can add to headline GDP just by having enough immigration to import more people into the country, that overall GDP gets bigger. But again, the causes of Britain's sluggish growth are really deep structural problems. If you take a sort of step back and look at it in the big picture, we have had negligible GDP per capita, productivity growth, and real wage growth since the crash, and arguably a bit before the crash, because a lot of the growth before the crash was propped up by easy consumer credit. So these are really deep-rooted problems, and any government that wants to break out of this deadlock that the British economy is in will need to do something dramatic to shake up the status quo. And I fear that Labour is really doing the opposite, because instead of making, as you were sort of talking about a minute ago with the cuts, instead of making some big painful decisions in year 1 about like significant strategic decisions to cut spending, right? Instead, they are trying to just maintain spending on the big things, the really significant budgets such as pensions, social care, the NHS. They're not really touching that at all.
Yeah.
And instead, they're sucking more money out of the economy. The employers' NI hike, which is really, as you and I know, are low-paid workers' NI hike, that is sucking consumer spending out of the economy, and it's not going to deliver growth.
Jane has been in touch on text 87222 with the word talk in her message. Perhaps it should be performance-related pay. The Chancellor should start in the NHS and Home Office. Perhaps no civil servant should be in more money than the Prime Minister. There's an idea, Jane. Rachel says, good afternoon, Peter. I have the afternoon off. A lovely treat to see you. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for spending your weekend off, your day off, I should say, watching this programme. Really appreciate that. I'm not sure which departments this comes under, but cutting back on funding for hotels for asylum seekers and asylum shoppers might be an idea. Well, that would be the Home Office, Rachel. They're the ones that I'm sure are under scrutiny. And actually, this brings us neatly to our next story, which is that the UK has suspended all Syrian asylum claims. Henry, what do you think about this and the reasoning behind this? Obviously, in the last few days, we've seen Damascus fall. Bashar al-Assad, a nasty piece of work, who has has left the country, scuttled away on a plane. But, of course, what comes next? And the coalition that is going to be in charge and is now in charge in Syria may not be a whole lot better necessarily. And we just don't know yet. It's too early days, really, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. This is often the case when one of these really awful regimes falls, because on the one hand, it really cannot be overstated how absolutely brutal the Ba'athist regime in Syria was. Long history of using chemical weapons against its own people and so on. There's very few people who are sad to see the back of it. But like many authoritarian regimes, it made sort of strategic alliances with minority groups. In particular, the Alawites, who are a Muslim minority sect who actually basically ran Syria under the Assads. So there are groups which, if a government takes place, if a complete shift in government takes place, would be vulnerable to persecution in their turn, and therefore a risk that there could be a fresh wave, even though tens of thousands of Syrians have already ended up in the UK since 2011. And that's going to be the other really thorny question for the government. Because if you came here over the last 10 years with an asylum claim predicated upon the idea that you were going to be persecuted by the Assad regime, and the Assad regime is now gone, does that mean that the government should be trying to work out, obviously safely, and once we've worked out what the new regime in Syria is, but does that mean that the government should be trying to work out a pathway for getting those people back to Syria?
To go home? Many of them may well want to go home as well. I was talking to a Syrian last night who was showing me on his phone some horrific images. I wish he hadn't shown them to me, actually, of what Assad had done. And I mean, there is just he looks like this sort of mild-mannered accountant, or perhaps the ophthalmologist that he was, but you absolutely need to know that he was a brutal and horrific dictator. It's good he's gone, but what comes next is a big question, and it's a question for our government as well. And the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, announced yesterday all Syrian asylum claims have been suspended. Let's listen to what she had to say.
Like Germany, like France and like other countries, we have paused asylum decisions on cases from Syria while the Home Office reviews and monitors the current situation.
There's some movement as well in terms of Germany and an agreement with Germany, because there was a loophole there, wasn't there, Henry, in regard to people coming into Germany and then coming across to Britain. Yvette Cooper, in fairness to her, and we do need to give her praise where praise is due, she does seem to have tightened up that loophole, but of course there is so much more to do in terms of stopping the boats and stopping illegal immigration to the UK.
Yeah, so the loophole was essentially that facilitating people smuggling through Germany to France and then onward to the United Kingdom wasn't illegal. And therefore you had people doing things like stocking up on the boats and the boat parts after they were manufactured elsewhere. They would be stockpiled in Germany rather than in France, where they could be sort of arrested and seized. And that deal has been closed. And this is a perfectly sensible deal, and it is absolutely right to recognise that Labour and the Home Secretary have delivered it. I think anytime a story like this happens, though, the point is that, oh, look, this is another country. In fact, it's Germany, a famously welcoming country to refugees in recent years, through which all of these people were passing in order to get to the French coast and risk drowning to get to the UK. So the problem that the government has, and it's the same problem that the previous government had, is that international enforcement is no substitute for dealing with the pull factors, which mean that people are prepared to move through safe countries in order to get to the United Kingdom. It's like the drugs war. As long as there is demand, which can be profitably met, whenever we knock out one gang, a new criminal gang will emerge because remember the outlay for this is a few trucks, some rubber dinghies, and no conscience, right?
Yeah.
There will always
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
criminal gangs prepared to do this. So we need to deal. Any enforcement action overseas is better than nothing, and it's absolutely correct to try it. But we need to deal with the factors that make the UK such an attractive target for illegal immigrants.